The clock inside reactor number 4 in Chernobyl still reads 1:23 a.m. and 58 seconds, as it has for the past 40 years, since the world's biggest nuclear disaster in 1986. Well, this image of the reactor was taken by the photojournalist Gert Ludwig. He was asked not to spend more time inside. He was asked for a few more seconds to go beyond what other media have been allowed inside. This is in the early 2000s, and he captured that image of the frozen clock inside the reactor room. Well, Ukrainians today, as you can see here, commemorating the anniversary in Kyiv. We're going to head there in a moment. There were more than 200 workers on site that day. Firefighters immediately hospitalised after the incident. Many symptoms classified as acute radiation syndrome. 28 of them died within 3 months. The World Health Organization predicted the disaster caused up to 9,000 cancer-related deaths in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. The figures often debated. Other assessments could say it could be tens of thousands. Well, to contain the nuclear fuel since then, first a concrete sarcophagus was built in the immediacy, then a second container shelter costing $1.5 billion, completed in the past 16 years. The site was briefly occupied by Russia at the start of its 2022 invasion and damaged by Russian drone last year. Emmanuelle Chaze is our correspondent in Kyiv, who's just got back from within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And we also have Dr. David Marples. He's a prominent Canadian historian, distinguished professor in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta in Canada, prolific author of more than 20 books writing about Chernobyl since the 80s. And he was one of the first to go there, scholars allowed to see the site. So let's start with you, Emmanuelle. Great to see you tonight. We'll look at the time you and David have spent in Chernobyl shortly and contrast now and then. But tell us first about the commemorations, what's been happening in Kyiv today and what's been said.
Well, first there was a night of commemoration in Slabotic. It is a city, a satellite city to the nuclear power plant, and it is where a lot of the liquidators, those nearly 600,000 people who came from all over the USSR to try and decontaminate the zone in the aftermath of the catastrophe, were lodged. It is also where current workers of the power plant and many of their families live. So commemorations took place there because, of course, they cannot take place in the exclusion zone. It is still highly radioactive there. It is still an abandoned place. I'm thinking about, in particular, the town of Pripyat, where 50,000 people were evacuated in the aftermath of the catastrophe. So big commemorations, not celebration, big commemorations there in Slabotic. Overnight, it started a little bit before the actual time that you were mentioning, at which the clock stopped ticking back on the 26th of April 1986. So at that exact moment, 40 years later, commemorations started. Here in Kyiv today, I was at an exhibition which opened just a few days ago, which presents Chernobyl, as is the Ukrainian name, as an object of shelter, because this exclusion zone has also been a biosphere since 2016. It is a sanctuary. It is highly radioactive, but it's also where protected species can thrive in an environment usually not touched by man. This has dramatically changed since 2022, since there's been increased military activity in the zone. It endangers species that live here, but most of all, it also endangers mankind as a whole. When Russia, for example, launches drones at the sarcophagus that is protecting reactor 4 from emitting more radiation.
Emmanuelle, stay with us. Let's just explore then and now. Dr. Marples is here with us as well. Great to see you tonight. Welcome to France 24, Dr. Marples. As I understand it, you were one of the first group of Western scholars to be granted access to tour Chernobyl, the city, back in 1989. Take us back there. Why you wanted to go, the sights you saw, the feeling you had as well, being there back then, and the risks.
Yeah, it actually wasn't a tour. It was an individual visit. I went by myself, and it was something I'd been working on for some time, not Chernobyl specifically, but nuclear power in Ukraine as an alternative energy source. And I applied to go to Chernobyl immediately after the disaster, but it took 3 years before the permission was granted. And I went there from Kyiv. I was taken there by an official from what was called the Combinat Production Association. Took me to the town of Chernobyl first. We had a discussion there with some of the personnel in the town. And then I was taken by a bus right to the station and taken around the second reactor. Obviously, I couldn't go to the fourth one. I interviewed the plant director. Not again, he wasn't there at the time, but he was the second one after the accident. And at that time, he was under sort of siege from environmental groups and anti-nuclear activists, and it was a difficult time for him. And then I went around Pripyat, where you could see the experiments done with irradiated plants, shoots taken from the trees in the nearby forest, which was eventually cleared completely. You could see discarded cars, you sort of like a dump of cars that had been left there. And it was possible to interview even some firemen in the Center for Radiation Medicine in Kiev, and also some of the people, both scientists who were dealing with the accident, and also some of the journalists and other activists in the Ukrainian community who were questioning the official version of Chernobyl and what they saw as a complete cover-up.
3 years on from the incident, David, you were watching, you've talked about in your books as well, the cleanup operation still well underway. And you've written, I think I'm right to say, you talked about a cavalier attitude back then, reservists sitting in ditches marked with danger radiation, but the signs, and they're in their overall seemingly oblivious or indifferent to the warnings. Plus, a cleanup crew back then eating lunch, sandwiches on the ground. Just tell me some of those observations you were making as well about the care going on back then.
I mean, it's difficult. You know, this is almost like ancient history in 1986, right? I mean, there are no mobile phones. There was simply one road to Chernobyl for everyone to go to, whether it was fire trucks or other transport. Helicopters you see in the picture there dropping boron, sand and lead onto the open reactor to try and cover it, actually pushing it down to the ground. And eventually coal miners had to come and build a shelf underneath the reactor to prevent it falling down to the water table. They had Geiger counters, but these Geiger counters only went up to a certain level, 25 rem on the old Soviet measurement system. And in fact, the people there would incur about 100 rems within a few minutes of working. So these Geiger counters were essentially useless. And then the evacuation, which didn't start until 40 hours after the accident. Again, first of all, the people from Pripyat were taken by buses to different venues, but where would you take them? And it turns out initially they went in the same direction that the radiation cloud dropping rainfall onto settlements went. So then they had to be evacuated again. And in that time, people were not welcoming to people who came from Chernobyl. They thought they might be contaminated by them because of the radioactivity. There were all kinds of rumors. People recommended things like red wine and vodka as a cure for radiation. And people didn't want to eat the food. They didn't want to eat vegetables. You know, they didn't have clean supplies of water. You name it, there were these problems. And the Soviet authorities had the idea that if you actually could export goods from Chernobyl across the Soviet Union, then you would sort of level out the impact these irradiated products might have on the population. This was the kind of mindset in 1986. And we could remember that Gorbachev had just been in power for a month at that time. And people had no idea what the impact of his period in charge would be. Glasnost was something that had been announced, but it didn't exist in reality. It only came into effect 2 or 3 years later when we began to get real information about Chernobyl's effects.
So from Soviet Chernobyl back then to Ukrainian Chernobyl now, Emmanuelle, tell us what you've seen in recent days, what it was like for you. You know, this is an area now, I'm told, full of Russian, Ukrainian landmines within the region as well, on top of the radiation risk. Just tell us about that experience.
It was a very special experience to be in that exclusion zone. I was mentioning it is still highly radioactive there, so you cannot go there without a dosimeter, which will then ring an alarm anytime radiation is above the normal level. It rang throughout the visit, first off, especially when we were walking from the road into a building, because vegetation has taken over the roads and the entrances and the path to the buildings. And because the soil is still highly contaminated, the most dangerous areas would be, the forest, the bushes that you have to go through to enter buildings. So that was first striking. What was striking, of course, is to see Pripyat, this city of 50,000 inhabitants, which is now completely abandoned, seeing the hospital where the first gravely irradiated, the first responders, in fact, were brought even before Pripyat was evacuated on the 26th of April. It's still a city that is frozen in time, if you will. It is completely deserted. Vegetation has grown all over the buildings, but you can imagine it was one of the, flagship atom city of the USSR. It's where, the population was the youngest in Ukraine, 26 years of age on average. So those were young families, young workers who were brought there, who were offered facilities and high salaries because, of course, the authorities knew also that they were facing health risks by working at the nuclear power plant. So they had to have an incentive to be there. So that was for Pripyat. And then being on the site of the nuclear power plant, seeing, the damage caused by a Russian drone back in 2025, I was talking to workers there, and they were saying, nobody in Ukraine could have imagined that someone could be, foolish enough to try and damage a nuclear power plant. But since 2022, Ukrainians have come to the realization that Russia, doesn't respect treaties of nuclear safety with the occupation of Chernobyl in 2022, but also with the current occupation of Europe's biggest nuclear power plant, that of Zaporizhzhia. It has been occupied for over 4 years now. There's multiple power cuts, blackouts happening there, which means that it has to run on diesel generators in order to keep its reactors cool. This could also imply that there would be a nuclear risk at any point now.
Yeah, it's a constant state of observation all around the clock. Just listening to that, David, there is this odd paradox, isn't there? Because we hear about the wildlife that seemingly is flourishing. We just saw some images of the horses, we hear wolves, lynx roaming. Over the years, the idea that wildlife is seemingly flourishing in the aftermath of a nuclear disaster, the sense that the absence of humans has been more impactful than the presence of nuclear contamination.
Yeah, I think it's helped the area in that respect. But nevertheless, it's still a sort of tragic situation where you would have to abandon an entire area with thousands of people on both sides of the border. Actually, the same applies to Belarus, where they're on the sort of northern side of the 30-kilometer zone around the reactor, where they were evacuated as well. I visited some of these areas as well in more recent years, and they're really affected. The families there don't live very well. The morbidity rates, the illness among the population is still higher on average than the rest of the population. So it's a tragic landmark in many ways. And yet, ironically, Ukraine and Belarus have turned back to nuclear power. This is something they rejected. After Chernobyl, many atomic stations were closed down. Belarusian side didn't have any. They've decided to go with nuclear power now. They've already got 2 reactors in operation. And in Ukraine, about 50% of electric power comes from nuclear stations. So it's actually extremely important to Ukraine, especially in the context of this war, Russian invasion, that nuclear power remains. It's one of the great ironies for me to come from the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. Now people need this energy source. It's a paradox, but there it is.
Yeah, it's a brief, just kind of myth. I think I'm right in saying it's very quiet, but both of you touched upon this. David, you talked about it's not completely abandoned. Pripyat, the other sites around them, there are people living there. And I think I listened to the other day, who's been on this program before, Matthew Sparks at The New Scientist, who said he went recently. There were couples in their 80s, so huge orchards growing apples. He said the apples tasted incredible. So that it's not completely abandoned. Is that right?
Well, certainly, although officially the places were evacuated, there were the so-called Samaseli, maybe older people, self-settlers, if you like, who went back to their homes because they simply didn't want to move. I mean, evacuation is a very stressful process, and people at that time, if they were in, say, their 50s or 60s, they'd lived there their entire lives, then moving them was probably more dangerous than them staying at home. So many of them chose to come back, and the dangers of, let's say, cancer in the longer term were less threatening to them than moving. You know, they simply didn't want to move. So they stayed there and they lived there. And perhaps that's okay in itself, but they were then visited by children and grandchildren who were then subject to the radiation in the background. And that was a problem. We got a lot of cases of thyroid gland cancer among children, which was brought about by the early fallout of radioactive iodine. It is probably the single most discernible illness resulting from the nuclear disaster. Again, in Belarus, something like 3,000 cases in the first 4 years after the disaster. Wow. In Ukraine, I think it was discovered a little bit later, but nevertheless, quite notable. So it is a problem that people went back illegally. But how to stop it? You know, how do you stop people going back at that age?
And on that issue, you've struck something in me, actually, a chord that I'm thinking, Emmanuelle, you've talked very clearly about the vulnerability in the midst of this war. But I remember hearing, just tell me about the credence of this. After the success of the HBO series Chernobyl, the reports of this popularity of so-called dark tourism, mawkish tourism, is it possible to do that? Does it still go on?
So it was possible before the full-scale invasion to visit the exclusion zone. You cannot just go by yourself with hiking shoes and a backpack. You have to ask the state agency for the handling of the exclusion zone to have a special authorization. And then you have to have a guide that is known by this agency. And now, for example, when I went to the exclusion zone, we were also accompanied by a soldier because it is a militarized zone. So you cannot just go. It was possible before 2022. And in fact, when Russia occupied the nuclear power plant of Chernobyl, there were what are called stalkers. Those are the people who go into the exclusion zone without an authorization. They try and find a way to get into the zone. And they were in the paths of the Russian army when it walked towards the nuclear station, the nuclear power plant, and they were actually imprisoned and taken hostages for the 5 weeks that occupation lasted. So you can go, but you can go at your own risk. And of course, it is not allowed to go officially without an authorization. And of course, now that it has become an even more dangerous zone with the risk of Russian strikes and also with the radioactivity that was also increased after this increased military activity in the sector, it is less of an incentive for people to visit. That being said, I've talked over the past few weeks to a number of liquidators and a number of evacuees who were born in the region so long before the disaster. And indeed, there are many people who would like to come back, people who grew up there, who would like to go at least a couple of times a year to see, not only to visit their houses, but also to visit their ancestors, to go to cemeteries, to pay their respects to their ancestors. So it is still a place that holds, Chernobyl is still a place that Ukrainians think a lot of. And I think there has been around 350,000 people evacuated from the zone. There's tens of thousands of them here in Kiev. Among those people in the northeastern suburb of Troyeshina here in Kiev, they also have to face, those night attacks of Russian drones. Recently, there was the widow of the first known victim of the explosion back in 1986. His widow died mid-November in a Russian drone strike in that area of Troyeshina. So it's a second tragedy being experienced by those evacuees.
Really good to hear from you both tonight. Thank you, Emmanuelle. Thank you. Emmanuelle Chaze, our correspondent in a cold-looking Kyiv today. And we also have Dr. David Marples, prominent Canadian historian specialising on Eastern Europe, also prolific author, the most recent book, Belarus, What Everyone Needs to Know. Thank you both for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.